Okay, so last time we talked about the process of doing journalism, and today we're going to look at the actual process of interviewing, one of the primary ways that journalists go about getting their information for stories. And so, as I often tell students, if you are a terribly extroverted person, then interviewing may come very naturally to you. If you're not, don't be afraid. This is a chance for you to develop those interpersonal skills and those conversational skills. And it may be, you may find yourself being a little nervous at first, but if you're prepared and you know how the process is supposed to go, then it's really just getting out there and talking to somebody. So I hope you enjoyed the video. As always, let me know if you have questions, and we'll talk to you soon. Okay, in the last video we talked about the process of journalism in fairly broad strokes. And we talked about interviewing as one of the primary ways that reporters go about collecting information, doing the research portion of the journalistic process. We talked about how interviewing is one of the main ways that they do that. So I wanted to get a little bit more in depth into the actual interviewing process today. Okay, so when you first start out and you're requesting the interview, whether it's over the phone or by email or you go by in person, the first thing that you want to do is you want to identify who you are and whom you work for. It's important that your source understands that you are approaching them as a journalist, that the questions you ask and the answers that they provide are intended for broad publication. This information is going to go out to a general audience, and so it's important that they understand this is not just a private conversation between two individuals. This is an interview that you are asking for so that you can get information that will then go into a publicly available story of some kind. And when you request the interview, they're likely to ask you what the story is going to be about or what kind of questions you want to ask. And so it's important that you give them an understanding of the questions, but generally speaking, you want to avoid giving them a specific list of questions that you intend to ask ahead of time. This is because we want to get candid responses to the questions that we ask, and particularly when you're dealing with bureaucrats or people in leadership positions, they will often want you to provide the questions to them ahead of time so that they can polish their responses or perhaps even just email you back canned, typed out responses. But a journalist really needs to try to push back against that as much as possible. Yes, in this day and age, email is certainly a valuable resource for communication, and sometimes you will get information from sources only through email. But generally speaking, an email correspondence is not an actual interview, again, because they're able to craft their responses and spin them so that they come across in just the right light that they want to. There's also a question that you're never entirely certain who's on the other end of that computer terminal. When you speak to someone on the telephone, you hear their voice. When you see someone in person, obviously you sit down with them or are there in person with them, and you know that this is the person that you are attributing this information to in your story. When you send an email to someone, there's always the possibility that it may not actually be the person responding that you think it is. An official may delegate this task out to one of his or her staff members. And so it becomes more difficult to actually say with certainty that the information you're being provided is coming from this specific person as a source. You certainly want to make sure that you set up an appropriate time and place to conduct the interview. And depending on what kind of information you want to get, it may determine where and when you conduct the interview. If you're wanting to be able to go out to a construction site and observe progress on a particular building project, then you may very well want to set up an interview with the project manager out at the site. However, you also may find yourself in a position where you're not getting all of the information that you want. Maybe the project manager is distracted, or maybe the noise of the construction site makes it difficult to ask questions and to hear what your source is saying to you. And so you may also want to conduct an interview in that person's office where you have more of a quiet and focused setting. But again, depending on what kind of information you're wanting to get, the actual time and place of the interview may differ. Be polite, but be confident, right? So you certainly don't want to call up a source and demand an interview with them. You're highly unlikely to ever get anyone to speak with you if that's your approach. But at the same time, there's no reason for you to expect that people don't want to speak with you. And so if you call up with a polite confidence, letting the source know who you are and what it is that you are wanting to do. You're wanting to set up an interview and the nature of the story that you are trying to write. Then it's then on them. If they don't want to speak with you, they'll let you know. But if you approach it requesting an interview as if you don't really think that it would be worth their time to speak with you, then they're not likely not to think that it's going to be worth their time either. So be polite, but be confident. Okay, so when it comes to actually getting the interview, actually conducting the interview, there's some basics that you want to keep in mind. And the first is the 5 W's and an H. We all remember these: the who, what, where, when, why, and how. And it may seem elementary, but surprisingly, many young reporters often get so caught up in trying to ask various detailed questions that they forget to come back to the who, what, where, when, why, and how. And so whether it's in preparing for your interview or when you're actually out there conducting the interview, you always want to make sure that you, at the bare minimum, get the 5 W's and an H. You want to also make sure that you get a person's name that's both first and last spelled correctly. Many times I have seen young writers turn in stories that say only John said. Well, I don't know who John is. Your reader doesn't know who John is. That's equivalent to an anonymous source, which is a whole other discussion. And for purposes of my class, I simply don't allow students to use anonymous sources. And there's a host of legal and ethical reasons for that. But many newsrooms also carry that policy that they simply do not allow their reporters to use anonymous or confidential sources. So we always want to make sure that we get the first and the last name of the individual. And we want to make sure that it's spelled correctly. There's nothing that will make you look like more of an amateur than to misspell someone's name in a news story. So before you even start in on your questions about the story itself, I would encourage you to just go ahead and get these details out of the way, the first and last name of the source spelled correctly. And likewise, whatever their title is, or maybe a relationship to someone else in the story, we need to have some understanding of why that person is in the story, why you're quoting them, or why you're attributing information to them, what makes them an authority on this matter, or what makes them a relevant person in this story. When it's appropriate, get the person's age. So if you're doing a personality profile on someone, certainly age is likely to be appropriate. If you're dealing with an authoritative source, if you're doing some story, let's say, about a new policy at the University of Tampa, and you're interviewing, let's say, the dean of students or someone like that, it's unlikely to be relevant that you would need to include that person's age. But when it's appropriate, certainly get the age. And also in the interview, make sure you take that time to verify any dates or monetary figures, measurements, time frames, acronyms, any kind of facts or details that are specific. And again, journalism is based on accurate telling of the facts. And so you want to make sure that you have those confirmed. Real quick about acronyms. This often comes up if you're interviewing people that have a military or government background, and they love to speak in acronyms, and they can roll them off the tip of their tongue like it was a second language. And the problem is that for people outside of those settings, people that don't work in the military or in a governmental environment, we're not as immediately familiar with these acronyms. And so you as the reporter need to get your source to pause, to back up, to clarify and explain what it is that they're talking about. So make sure you get those things uh, laid out and clearly understood in your interview before you leave your source. When you're preparing for your interview, you want to develop your questions first in the order of what's your must-have questions. What do you have to have answered? You don't want to get to the end of the interview and find that you've spent the entire 30 minutes that your source gave you talking about information that wasn't really all that important in the first place. So make sure you get your must-have questions answered up front. After that, you can move on to the questions that you would like to have answered that might not be quite as critical. Certainly, they will add useful information to your story or perhaps provide you with a better understanding whether or not you choose to use the information in your actual article or not. But you can move on to the would like questions, the questions you would like to have answered after you have those must-haves. And as I said just a minute ago, certainly you want to make sure that you get the specifics of dates and times and monetary figures and other facts in your interview. You want to make sure that you have a clear understanding of those. But you also want to make sure you ask mainly open-ended questions, right? You don't want simple yes-no answers to the questions that you have. Generally speaking, sometimes you will need a yes or no, but you want to give the source an opportunity to elaborate and to really go into detail and share what he or she thinks is important about the story that you're covering. So yes, ask questions that get to the facts, but also ask a lot of open-ended questions that allow your source to really speak candidly about what he or she thinks is important. Now, while you want to get your must-have questions up front, you generally want to save the hard questions for last. You don't want to have your source shut down on you at the very beginning of your interview. If you have a hardball question that you need to ask, something that really puts your source on the spot, you're likely best served to save that question towards the end of the interview. And that way, if your source does shut down and stop talking to you, decide that he or she is done with this interview, you still have all of the main information that you need already in the first part of that interview. Sometimes when you ask a question as a reporter, it doesn't quite come out of your mouth the same way that you understood it in your head. And so to avoid miscommunication, a lot of times you just need to rephrase a question. If your source doesn't quite understand what it is you're trying to ask, just ask it in a slightly different way. And that can go a long way to making sure that you and your source are both on the same page in terms of the information that you're trying to acquire. Two of the most helpful questions you can ask in an interview, generally towards the end, are, is there anything else that I haven't asked you or that we haven't covered that you think is important for me to know? And that can often open up a line of conversation that you didn't even know existed, information that you had no idea about, but simply by asking that one question, you open the door for your source to provide you with all of this information that you otherwise wouldn't have had. Asking anyone else, right, is there anyone else that I should speak with about this story, helps lead you from one source to another source who might provide valuable information for your story. Be responsive, but don't lead your source. So you don't want to put words in their mouth, but you do want to acknowledge that you're listening and hearing what they have to say. So nodding and and yeah, and yes, and simple conversational cues that acknowledge that you're listening, but that you're not trying to lead your source in what he or she says, will go a long way to getting an accurate and an authentic story and covering the story as it should be and not as you perhaps think it should be. Another trick that you can use in interviewing is to use silence. And so if you have a source who maybe hasn't answered a question perhaps as fully as you think you would like, him or her to have answered it. You can use silence. And a lot of times the source will fill in that space. Humans often don't like that period of awkward silence. So if you just hold out and let that silence linger sometimes, a lot of times your source will jump in to expand on what he or she has already said. And a lot of times it may be that the source is just using that period of silence to think and ponder a bit more on the question that you've asked. And so if you jump in there too quickly to cut that silence off, then again, you may be missing out on some really good information. And sometimes it's just nice to have a little bit of a pause in the conversation so that you can finish writing in your notes. It's also useful for audio editing purposes to have a few spots of silence in the conversation so that you have spots that you can go back and edit cleanly and clearly on your audio track. A few other things to keep in mind when you're conducting an interview: pay attention to the details, both verbal and nonverbal. That will help you ask useful follow-up questions and will help you really get a full understanding of what the source is trying to tell you. Be sensitive, particularly when it's a sensitive subject matter. You don't want to come across as a brash and insensitive reporter. Be fair, right? So you're there as a reporter, you have questions that need to be answered, but you don't want to try to be unfair in the questions that you're asking your source. You don't want to ask questions that are unnecessarily antagonistic. And so the more that your source feels like you're being fair with them and trying to do a responsible job as a journalist, then the more likely it is that they're going to respect your position and give you honest answers. Be smart when you're interviewing someone. Pay attention to the details of what they're saying and ask insightful and poignant questions. They'll respect you more and you'll get better information that way. And likewise, this also means that you want to show up prepared, right? You want to show up having done your homework. You want to show up being knowledgeable about the general topic that you are interviewing your source on, so that then you can build upon that familiarity to get more detailed and more specific information about the story. And look professional. Certainly you may dress differently depending on who it is that you're interviewing. You may find that a younger person, a child, would be intimidated if you show up in a three-piece suit. But if you're going to be interviewing the CEO of a company, a suit may be entirely appropriate. There's certainly slacks and a nice business shirt for a guy, or perhaps a nice suit for a lady would be appropriate in that context. But you want to look professional and show your source that you take your job seriously. Now, when it comes to actually taking your notes, of course, there's a variety of ways that you can do it. People often use audio recorders, and that's fine, but I would encourage you to not rely solely upon audio recorders because they can break. You may find that they cut off in the middle of an interview and you don't notice it, and then you are out of luck, right? When you get back to your desk and you go to try to access your notes, you have nothing. So if you take handwritten notes along with an audio recording, that's fine. And you may also find that it's just not convenient to have an audio recorder in all circumstances, whereas having a legal pad or a notebook or something like that to take handwritten notes in the field is much more efficient in some contexts. So when it comes to taking handwritten notes, use shortcuts. Find a shorthand formula that works for you. I like to drop the vowels in a lot of my words, and so that saves me time, and yet I can go back and still understand clearly what it is I was trying to say. Some people prefer to use the letter U instead of writing out Y-O-U, or the number 4 instead of F-O-R, but whatever works for you is what you should try to aim for. Slow the pace. And so if you're source is speaking very rapidly, try to get them to slow down. And it's fine to say, I'm just trying to take some notes here. Could you repeat that? Or maybe say that a bit more slowly for me. You're there to get the information that you need. And so if you need to, slow the pace with your source. Write notes for yourself. Everybody has a different way of writing notes. And so whatever works for you is really what you want to, use. You want to also make sure that you verify the information in your notes. Again, any facts that you collect in the process of the interview, make sure you verify those things in your notes. And review your notes while the interview is still fresh in your mind. That way, it'll help you understand your notes. Again, everybody has the note-taking system that works well for them, but even with that, sometimes if you let too much time go by between your interview and when you go back to your notes, you can lose some of the details. So if you go back over your notes while your interview is still fresh in your mind, it'll help solidify and crystallize the information that you got. So that's a quick crash course on the interviewing process and some things to think about as you prepare for your interview and then conduct your interview and then go back over and review your notes. But it's a process, it's a craft and a skill that you get better at as you go along, and you get quicker at note taking as you do more of it with your interviews. So the best thing is to just go out there and start talking to people, and you'll have a chance to do that in the second half of our semester when we go into our online only portion of the course. That's it for now. We'll see you next time.